So use extra, extra virgin olive oil. It's 100% pure, like me.
There are moments in television history that don't just get cancelled. They get erased. Not pulled from a schedule with a polite announcement. Not shelved with a press release explaining the decision. But quietly, deliberately vanished. No explanation. No trace. Just gone. And for years, fans are left wondering whether what they heard about was real, or just a rumor that grew legs. That's exactly what happened with one of the most talked about episodes in the entire run of Married with Children. An episode that was written, filmed, edited, and ready to air, and then, without a single word of public explanation, disappeared. For over a decade, it existed only as whispered legend among die-hard fans. Some believed it had been destroyed. Others thought it had quietly aired somewhere overseas and been forgotten. Most people who came to the show after its original run had no idea it had ever existed at all. But here's the thing about buried television. It never stays buried forever. And after more than 30 years, this episode is finally getting the release it was always owed. Tonight, we're going to talk about why it was made, why it was pulled, and why right now, in 2025, it matters more than anyone could have predicted back in 1989. To understand why one episode of Married with Children caused a network to quietly panic, you first have to understand what kind of show Married with Children actually was, and what American television looked like before it arrived. Cast your mind back to the mid-1980s. Primetime American television was a warm, comfortable place. Family sitcoms ruled the landscape. Shows like The Cosby Show, Family Ties, and Growing Pains were dominating ratings, and they all shared a common formula: loving parents, relatable children, small problems that dissolved neatly within 22 minutes, and a gentle lesson wrapped up at the end. Television families were aspirational. They were meant to reflect the best version of what a family could be. Then, in April of 1987, a show premiered on the then brand new Fox network that looked at all of that warmth and comfort and deliberately set it on fire. Married with Children introduced the Bundy family to America, and America was not entirely sure how to feel about it. Al Bundy, played by Ed O'Neill, was not a wise and patient father. He was a shoe salesman who despised his job, resented his customers, and spent most of his time on the couch with his hand down his pants, mourning the football career that never happened. Peg Bundy, played by Katie Sagal, was not a nurturing, dedicated housewife. She was a woman who refused to cook, never cleaned, and lived primarily for daytime television and spending money her husband didn't have. Their daughter Kelly, played by Christina Applegate, was not an endearing, funny teenager. She was aggressively, cheerfully unintelligent, and the show never let you forget it. Their son Bud, played by David Faustino, was scheming, self-interested, and chronically unsuccessful with women. None of them were meant to be admired. None of them were meant to be imitated. That was entirely the point. What the creators of Married with Children understood, and what made the show genuinely revolutionary, was that a significant portion of the American viewing public was exhausted by idealized television families. Working-class Americans who were struggling financially, whose marriages were difficult, whose kids were imperfect, didn't necessarily see themselves reflected in the Huxtables or the Keatons. The Bundys were a funhouse mirror version of real domestic life, exaggerated beyond recognition, yes, but rooted in a kind of uncomfortable truth that other sitcoms wouldn't touch. The humor was deliberately crude. The jokes were mean. The show mocked everyone: men, women, the wealthy, the poor, and most frequently, the Bundys themselves. It was transgressive in a way that felt almost radical for primetime broadcast television, and audiences responded. The show built a devoted following quickly, particularly among younger viewers who appreciated its refusal to moralize or pretend that family life was something it usually wasn't. Fox, as a fledgling network still trying to establish itself against the three long-dominant broadcast giants, leaned into the controversy. Married with Children was exactly the kind of programming that said Fox was different, edgier, younger, more willing to take risks. The show became one of the most important assets the network had in its early years. But that edge came with a cost. Because when you build a show around the idea of pushing limits, there will inevitably come a moment when you push too far, or at least, when someone in a position of power decides you have. The episode at the center of this story is called I'll See You in Court. It was written and produced during the show's third season, with every expectation that it would air in 1989 as part of the regular broadcast schedule. The cast rehearsed it. The crew filmed it. The editors cut it. By every measure, it was a completed episode of television, indistinguishable in its production from the dozens of episodes surrounding it. The plot followed a premise that, on paper, fit perfectly within the Married with Children universe. Al and Peg Bundy, in a rare moment of attempting to inject some excitement into their famously dismal marriage, check into a low-rent motel for what they hope will be a romantic getaway. What they don't discover until later is that the motel has hidden cameras installed in the rooms, and their private evening together has been filmed without their knowledge or consent. When they find out, they do what the Bundys always do: they decide to sue. What follows is a courtroom farce in which it becomes clear that the Bundys are far from the only victims. Their neighbors, the Rhodes, turn out to have visited the same motel and been recorded under the same circumstances. The episode escalates from there into the kind of deeply uncomfortable, aggressively awkward comedy that the show had always specialized in: testimony that crosses lines, revelations that humiliate, and a justice system that seems entirely more interested in laughing at the victims than helping them. From a purely creative standpoint, the people who made the episode largely considered it a strong entry in the series. The writers felt the motel premise was a natural extension of the show's sensibility. Katie Sagal later reflected that the story was completely consistent with everything Married with Children had always been: absurd, uncomfortable, and rooted in the specific humiliation of the Bundy marriage. Ed O'Neill reportedly couldn't understand why this particular episode was the one that caused problems, given that he had spent 3 seasons delivering lines about subjects far more explicit than anything in this script. But the content of the episode wasn't the only thing being weighed by Fox executives. The context mattered enormously. The late 1980s were a period of intense public scrutiny around the content of broadcast television. Advocacy groups were active and organized. Religious organizations had been monitoring primetime programming closely for years, applying pressure to networks and advertisers alike. And then, in early 1989, a single viewer wrote a letter that turned into a national news story. Her name was Terry Rakolta, a Michigan homemaker who had watched an episode of Married with Children with her children and been genuinely disturbed by what she saw. Rather than simply change the channel, she began writing directly to the show's advertisers, urging them to pull their financial support. Her campaign was not sophisticated, but it was persistent, and it worked. Several major corporate advertisers quietly withdrew their sponsorship from the show. The story attracted significant press coverage. Politicians and commentators weighed in. What had started as one woman's letter became a focal point for a much larger national conversation about decency standards in American entertainment. Fox was suddenly under a microscope. And into this atmosphere walked I'll See You in Court, an episode whose entire premise revolved around hidden cameras, non-consensual recording, intimate footage, and the public exposure of private moments. Even within the context of a comedy, the subject matter was legally and ethically charged in ways that made the network's legal and business teams deeply nervous. Advertisers were already skittish. Watchdog groups were already watching. An episode about secret sex tapes seemed like precisely the kind of grenade nobody wanted to throw. The decision was made quietly. The episode was pulled from the broadcast schedule without announcement, without explanation, and without any indication to the public that it had ever existed. It was, in the language of television production, buried. There is something about forbidden things that makes people obsess over them. A film that gets banned becomes more discussed than a film that wins awards. An album that gets pulled from shelves sells more in bootleg form than it ever would have through normal distribution. And a television episode that disappears without explanation becomes the most talked about episode the show ever produced. That is precisely what happened with I'll See You in Court, over the years following its suppression. Among Married with Children's dedicated fan base, rumors about the missing episode circulated constantly. Stories spread that it had aired once in Canada. Others claimed a friend of a friend had seen it broadcast late at night somewhere in the American Midwest. Some believed it had been partially destroyed. Others were convinced that it had never actually been completed, and that the whole story was an exaggeration. None of these stories were true. The episode had been completed in full and was sitting in a vault, entirely intact, deliberately excluded from every rerun package, every home video release, and every syndication deal. Fox had not destroyed it. They had simply acted as though it didn't exist, and hoped everyone would take the hint and move on. They didn't. Cast members were asked about the episode at reunions and in interviews for years. The show's creators referenced it in retrospective conversations. Television journalists occasionally wrote about it as an example of broadcast censorship and the strange, sometimes arbitrary decisions that networks make under pressure. The episode had taken on a life entirely separate from its actual content. It had become a symbol of what television was and wasn't allowed to say, and who got to make that decision. Then, in 2002, something unexpected happened. FX, which had acquired the rights to the Married with Children catalog for syndication purposes, quietly included I'll See You in Court in a weekday afternoon rerun block. No promotion. No announcement. No explanation. The episode simply aired, in full, unedited, for the first time in American broadcast history.